convidar para vir até o palco Adrian Hope Bailey, por favor. O Adrian, ele é o diretor para padrões web na Ripple Labs e trabalha representando a Ripple Labs em organizações internacionais de padronização, promovendo uma visão da empresa, de uma empresa aberta, inclusiva, né, que respeita a internet dos valores, construído, obviamente, sobre padrões globais. O Adrian, ele é nativo da África do Sul, é também engenheiro de software, que tem experiência em empreendedorismo, gerente de produto, consultor, pesquisador e também palestrante, ainda bem. Trabalhou como consultor em empresas de tecnologias em pagamentos móveis, bancos e empresas que processam pagamentos na África, na Europa e também na América do Norte. Tem a palavra, Adrian, por favor. Obrigado.
Thank you. Thank you, Wagner. Thank you, everyone, for having me. Thank you, W3C, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I also want to thank all of you for enduring another keynote in English. I come from a country with 11 official languages, so I appreciate how important language is. Thank you for your patience. Obrigado por ouvir. So my journey that's brought me here has sort of two parallel tracks. The first has to do with internet standards and the other payments. Many years ago, in the 90s, as a teenager, I started playing around on the web, doing development, HTML, CSS, and then the DHTML. I don't know if any of you remember dynamic HTML. It was the early days of scripting. And I was devastated to discover one day that a page I had built, I think it was probably a homage to Nirvana or Kurt Cobain or something, didn't work properly when I looked at it in Netscape Navigator. So I built this page and I'd actually scripted it in VB script. So there's a technology that didn't go anywhere on the web. And that was really where my interest in standards started. So that opened my eyes, at least, to the fact that when you build on the web, you're building in this complex ecosystem. And standards are critically important to enable interoperability and to enable everybody to sort of build once and work everywhere. It's a fantastically complex but fantastically powerful platform. About 6 years ago, I joined a company in South Africa who were involved in selling payments products. And that was the beginning of my career in payments. And it also captivated me. Payments is a really interesting field because like the web and like most other programming environments, there's this need for standardization and interoperability. So the company I worked for sold card payments products. And there's a standard called ISO 8583, which is still used universally by card payments companies, despite the fact that the last version of it, I think, was standardized in 2003. So it gives you an idea of the legacy that we're carrying there. Anyhow, at a certain point, I think it was about 2 years ago, there was a particular problem that was bugging me. And in South Africa, we have a fairly robust, a fairly world-class payments system, in fact. And the problem that frustrated me was it's very easy for me to send money to somebody else in South Africa, but it's really frustrating to get their payment details from them. So in South Africa, I can log on to my internet banking, I can pull out my phone, use my phone's mobile banking application, and to send you money, all I need is the bank that you bank at, your account number, and sometimes your branch code. But those are not the kind of things that you put on your blog. You know, if I want to pay you money, I have to ask you for that information specifically. And it's sensitive information, but it's also something that I could make a mistake with if I have to capture it myself. There was no standardized way to share that information. there wasn't an equivalent of a V card or a contact card for payment details. So that got me thinking, and it became something of an obsession of mine. And in my explorations on the web, I discovered a group at the W3C called the Web Payments Community Group. And I've been quite involved with them for getting close to 2 years now. Really interesting group of people, diverse bunch of stakeholders, people interested in digital rights management, people interested in micropayments, people interested in various elements of payments. So I've been involved in the Web Payments Community Group, as I say, for about 2 years. And then I think it was around a year ago, there was some real momentum behind payments within the W3C. The W3C hosted a few workshops, and in November last year, the Web Payments Interest Group was officially chartered within the W3C. And what that is a group of stakeholders from various spheres within payments coming together and trying to figure out what we can do on the web to improve the state of payments. It includes banks, it includes central banks, clearing houses, retailers, payment processors, technology companies. It's really quite a diverse group of stakeholders. So around, I would say, March of this year, Ripple Labs joined the interest group, and I got chatting to one of the engineers at Ripple Labs, a guy called Evan, and we were exchanging ideas via email. And at some point we decided it was time to have a conversation. So we set up a call, about a 9-hour time difference between him in San Francisco and me in Johannesburg. We set up a call for, I think it was Thursday, and we were going to chat on Monday evening. Anyhow, long story short, by the time Monday came around, we weren't exchanging ideas anymore. I was having a job interview. So I flew out to San Francisco in April. I joined Ripple Labs, and I've been working with them since April this year. So thanks for the life story, Adrian. What's the point? It was after my first month at working at Ripple Labs that I discovered the other payments problem on the web. So I've been solving a particular bugbear, a usability issue. But the real fundamental issue with payments today isn't that little bit of Chrome that we all deal with. It's the underlying infrastructure. The real problem with payments on the web today is that the average cost of international remittances is almost 8%. In fact, in South Africa, it's even worse. We're amongst the most expensive place in the world to do international remittances. I think it's close to double that number. I'm not sure if you know this, but Brazil is the second most expensive country in the world to send money into, after China. So that's a big problem, and it's a problem that I think is worth trying to solve, and it's a problem that I and the people I work with at Ripple Labs truly believe can be solved through open standards. It's a problem that can be solved by leveraging the web and the way the web and the internet works to fix infrastructure that hasn't changed for 20-something years. I think you'll agree with me, this is a problem worth dealing with. So what you can see on the screens there is what's often called the four-party model. It's a very simplistic model for describing flow of payments, and it's used by banks, it's used by most people in the payments industry to describe the flow of value. So it could be, the arrows could represent messages, the arrows could represent actual flow of money, but it's a simplistic way of saying I've got a sender, I've got a receiver, they have account holding institutions, normally a bank, and then there's a whole lot of complexity up there in that little gray block, which gets the money from sender to receiver. So that model is actually quite useful in describing the two areas, if you like, that we're addressing through standards at the W3C today. Down at the bottom, we've got that classic problem, which I've originally frustrated me, and that was payment initiation. How do we take those conversations we have every day in the physical world about I owe you money, I need to pay you, how do you accept payment? These are the ways I can pay you. How do we turn that into something that works on the web so that it's seamless, so that it's easy to do, so that the ecosystem is open? And then the other problem we're trying to solve is the big one, the infrastructure problem. How do we move money on the web in a way that's more efficient? So in terms of the payment initiation problem, fundamentally our biggest issue is user behavior. Retraining people is one of the hardest things to do. And we have this ecosystem around us of existing cards out in the world, existing card machines, existing ways to pay. I know in Brazil you guys use the boleto a lot, and there's infrastructure in place to support that. But a lot of that predates the internet. So for 20 odd years, we've been trying to figure out how to force these old payment instruments into a different way of thinking, a way of interacting in a digital world that we're used to on the web. And so what we're trying to do at the W3C, or our approach, is to fix that piece by making it easier to introduce new ways to pay that don't require you to retrain the users. And this is not to say that the existing payment networks, the existing payment instruments are bad necessarily. They've tried to solve this problem. In fact, if you look at the card networks, almost all of them have a digital wallet already today. They're trying really hard to get people to use digital wallets. But teaching people how to use a digital wallet instead of a card is really difficult. I like to say, if something's easier to ignore than to use, it's never going to succeed. And I think that's the case with digital wallets predominantly, is why would I use it if I know how to use my card and it's just easy to do? And I think for us, a technical audience, sometimes that's not obvious. But out there in the world, people who don't necessarily understand even what they're doing when they're entering their card number onto a website or entering some other payment credentials onto a website, that change is just too scary. So our approach in terms of fixing the initiation problem is that we're in the process of chartering a working group. It's the Web Payments Working Group. And the scope of that working group is quite specific, and it's quite straightforward. And it revolves around development of an API in the browser so that you can request a payment. Development of a standard vocabulary to define all of the information that needs to be exchanged. I wish you could see the amount of debate that's gone on around terminology in payments, because depending who you speak to, different words mean different things, and whether that's international differences or just differences between what retailers call settlement and what banks call settlement. Those kind of things are important to solve. Then we are defining a set of standard messages that can be exchanged for this initiation flow and a standardized flow. And the result, my hope is the result, we'll come up with something that looks a little bit like this. That's a mobile version of what we're talking about, but it should extend to any other platform upon which you're running a web browser, or where you can access the web. So from within the website, I call navigator payments, request a payment, and I pass in a bunch of information, and I get back a response from a digital wallet or a digital payment instrument, or whatever the case may be. That thing that is now enabled to do much more complicated payments, credential gathering, security, than a page where I enter in card details. So the ultimate outcome here is a consistent flow for users. A user visits a page, they want to check out, they hit pay, or they want to send money to someone, they hit pay. Instead of being redirected to a new page to choose how to pay, capture the details, and so on, their wallet comes into the foreground, or the wallet appears in an iframe if it's cloud-based. They choose the way they want to pay. All of that is done outside of the scope of the site that's accepting the payment, and the response, whether it's tokenized credentials, encrypted card numbers, a proof of payment because the payment was actually initiated completely out of band of the web. Any of those methods of payment is now possible because the flow is standardized, simple, and it's a mere exchange that replicates the physical interactions we have today in making a payment. The problem is we've only solved a very small problem. We've made payments easier for people, but we haven't fixed the underlying infrastructure. And that really is a much bigger problem. It doesn't matter how much we do on the top layer, how much we do at the application or user experience layer. The underlying infrastructure needs a refresh. It needs a fresh look. And as the saying goes, you know, it doesn't matter how much lipstick we put on that pig, it's still a pig. So at Ripple Labs, and we've been, you know, sharing these ideas within the W3C, and we've got a lot of support for them, we believe that there's a lot we can learn from the evolution of the internet, the evolution of the web, in how we can evolve payments. If you look at where the web started, it was infrastructure. It was educational institutions, military institutions, putting down infrastructure to communicate, developing protocols like TCP/IP to communicate with each other. What followed was a consumer-facing, federated model where people like AOL, CompuServe, all allowed you to dial in and connect into their little network built on that infrastructure. But ultimately, the real power came from a development of open protocols that linked all of those together. That's the key, is you have all of these closed, siloed, federated networks, and then you have an open protocol that allows them to interact. So in the days, in the current world of call it the Internet of Information, that's easy. We use things like SMTP for email. We use HTTP to exchange data across domains. What we need to figure out is, what does that protocol look like for value? What does that protocol look like for money? How do I have a Bitcoin address and I want to pay you into your bank account? And it just works. The internet finds a path for that payment. What we need is an SMTP for money. So if I compare my experience in trying to move money when I joined Ripple Labs to South Africa with my experience of sending an email when I go to São Paulo, they're vastly different. So earlier I said, you know, what was the point of that whole life story? Well, the point was, after my first month at Ripple Labs, I got paid. I had US dollars sitting in a bank account in America. But what I also had was a mortgage in South Africa that needed to be paid in rands, and bills. And my wife runs up quite a big credit card bill, so it was a big bill that I needed to pay. And I discovered that 7.68% fee to move that money from America to South Africa was really prohibitive. It was something I hadn't accounted for in how I was going to deal with my personal finances. Contrast that with my experience arriving in São Paulo on Sunday evening, getting out of the airplane, turning on my phone, connecting to the Wi-Fi, sending an email to my wife to say, I'm safely here, please don't spend all our money while I'm gone. That was simple. It didn't matter which internet service provider I used. It didn't matter which email service she used or I used. The SMTP protocol figures it out for you. The email leaves my outbox and arrives in her inbox, and it may take many hops, it may take a single hop, but it gets there. And that's really what we need to try and find for the movement of money on the web. Fundamentally, when we talk about settlement, we're talking about movement of ones and zeros. It's all digital today, right? When we settle between two people, it's not like the bank goes and puts a whole lot of money in a truck and drives it to the other bank and unloads it. There's not real physical money sitting in vaults. Predominantly, movement of money is happening on ledgers. It's a central bank or some central counterparty sitting between the sender and receiver institutions, and moving money out of this account into that account. It's movement of information, but it's carefully controlled, and it's in a managed flow. The challenge we have in designing this Internet of Value is that layer on top, that piece that deals with settlement, is actually extremely complicated. A basic payment, if we flatten it out, sender to receiver. On the sender side, his ledger is edited to take some money away, right? And the other side of that transaction is the bank maybe puts it in some suspense account or something. On the receiver side, they need their balance to go up. So where's the corresponding balance going down? It's going to be another suspense account or something from the bank. And normally there's a settlement system in the middle. The most obvious or simple model is when you have someone like a central clearinghouse or a central bank in the middle there. And they are the providers of that settlement infrastructure. The challenge is when it becomes international, it looks much more complicated. It goes through a huge number of counterparties along the way. But most importantly, it's hell of expensive. At every hop, there's a fee or an exchange rate spread that you're competing with. When you look online and you see the exchange rate between reals and dollars, that's not the rate you'll ever get from your bank, because that's the rate that you get at the mid-market. That's what they call the mid-market rate. And normally the spread, the difference between what the bank will buy and sell, is pretty wide. Because who are they competing with? Nobody really, the other banks. And that's the challenge we have to overcome, and that's the potential benefit we have from opening up this whole system. The challenge or the piece that we need to deal with in terms of an SMTP for money is that what email doesn't have is a need for liquidity or a huge amount of inherent risk in moving email. So you can't double spend an email, right? And at the same time, when I send an email to my wife in South Africa, the internet service provider doesn't have to have enough ones and zeros to send the email. There's not a liquidity requirement in sending email. And so we have to deal with that in designing an SMTP for money. We need to firstly control that risk in some way, and we need to provide the necessary liquidity. Now, unfortunately, liquidity and risk are often at loggerheads with one another. So the easiest way to control risk is to have a closed network. Is to make sure you only deal with people you know really well, and you don't depend on third-party credentials or anything like that. And that's how the architecture of most banking and payment systems works today. I know when I used to work in the card payment industry, card payment systems speak to each other in clear text. The protocol is clear. It's unencrypted. The only thing that's ever encrypted in there is a PIN. But card numbers, everything else is sent in the clear because they trust the fact that they have a dedicated line to the other system. They know who it is on the other side, and the channel is encrypted. And that's ancient architectural principles. That's something that we've improved on dramatically in the web. Now, the problem with that principle of control is that kills liquidity. So each payment network who's independently operating in their little silo is taking in a little bit of the money in the whole global ecosystem, and they're controlling that. That money is sitting under their control, and it can't be used to facilitate payments within another network. And so we've got this issue where our need to control risk is killing our ability to increase liquidity and competition. So the big challenge then is, how do we introduce this internet-style architecture? How do we put payments in a distributed, decentralized space and still deal with risk and liquidity? How do we know who that money is passing through along the way? And that's important. You know, certain countries have sanctions lists, for instance. If you live in America and you're sending money to the UK, that money goes via Iran, for instance. You're potentially in trouble. So you need to be able to control all of that stuff. And the good news is we've solved that long ago on the web. We use public key infrastructure. We know how to prove who we are using public and private keys and cryptography. We know how to encrypt things so that only certain people can see it. So what we need to do is take that knowledge, take those technologies that we already have today, and apply them to this problem. The result is quite exciting. The result is, instead of having closed networks and single counterparties to choose from, you create a competitive landscape, a landscape where people who are facilitating settlement are competing with each other on price, on the amount of liquidity they can provide, on their stability. How often does a payment fail with this settlement provider? And also on risk, reputation. So there's still a place for all the existing participants to be part of this ecosystem, but it levels the playing field and it opens it up for new participants. I saw a statistic earlier today, and I read it briefly, so I stand to be corrected, but I believe that 98% of foreign exchange still goes through banks. That's crazy, right? I mean, I can understand why it's like that because of the way the system is set up today. But where's their competition, right? Where's the ability for people who specialize in low cost of capital, who are really interested in a specific corridor? If I'm really interested in buying and selling rands for reals, I should be much more competitive than a multinational bank where this is a tiny little piece of their business. The value in this competitive landscape is that payments then have the ability to find the best path. If a payment finds the best, cheapest, most secure, whatever best means for you in your scenario, it can find the best path. So as somebody sending money, I can decide the most important thing to me is cost. I need this payment to go through at the lowest possible fee. Or I don't mind paying a little bit more, but I need guaranteed delivery. I need a guarantee that this payment's going through. Now, we don't have that today because there's no way of even shopping around for those different attributes from your settlement providers. And if we can open up this SMTP for money, the protocol should support those things. Another great advantage is true scalability. And this is where I'm going to potentially say something controversial. Global settlement is not going to work on a single ledger. I don't care how distributed it is. It can't. A single ledger, a single system, a single network can never scale to internet scale. That's not how the internet works. The internet works because it's distributed. It's truly decentralized and distributed. Sure, we have a few issues around DNS and things that are slightly centralized or controlled centrally. But for this to work, you need settlement systems to all be competing on a level playing field using an open protocol. Not an open network, an open protocol. And that's the key difference. Email wasn't successful because somebody developed the SMTP network. They developed the SMTP protocol, which allowed emails to move between networks. And that really is the key. The other advantage, of course, is redundancy. What do we do if everybody becomes dependent on a single network for exchange of value online? A single system, a single ledger, and that ledger goes down or it has a problem. The world's commerce falls down. If anyone's wondering why big banks or the financial industry are nervous about talk of using things like Bitcoin as the global currency for exchange, where's the redundancy? Where's the backup? What excites me the most about this whole scenario and this whole idea of exchanging value online in this way is the knock-on effects that it could have. When the early inventors of the web produced the standards that they produced and talked about the possibilities, I doubt that they realized the real magnitude of what they were giving the world. I don't think they would have appreciated that as the ability for information to move improved, the volume of information that moved around would increase so dramatically, so exponentially. And I believe that if we can release money, release value, unchain it from these closed networks, the same thing will happen. So anyone who's panicking about being disintermediated or cut out of the system, or incumbents who are scared of startups bringing these new ideas to the fore, should think about the fact that as soon as money moves more freely, more money will move. So you may not have the same size piece of the pie, but you'll have a smaller piece of a much bigger pie. Even if you're charging fractions of a cent for a transaction, the chances are you're dealing with a much bigger volume of transactions. And the other effects of this are really exciting. If you can guarantee that a transaction is going to complete in a certain amount of time because you pick the path that guarantees that for you, or you can guarantee elements around the cost of a transaction, there are whole new business models that we can introduce. Business models online today are limited by that floor, that bottom payment fee that everybody has to pay to process a payment. It's a few percent normally in the world of cards. It varies based on the payment instrument, but there's very few people who can offer you digital payment services at a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the total payment price. And as soon as that's possible, all of these scenarios around micropayments and payments really being integrated into the way the web works will be possible. So consider you visit a newspaper website, and for every article you read, you get charged R1. Minimal, it's a small amount. But you're prepared to do that because that website no longer throws ads in your face. They no longer collect personal information because they actually have a viable business model charging you for the service they provide. I'm unsure about this, but I really would like to believe that if we can solve payments on the web, if we can make money flow online as easily as information, we can get rid of all the privacy and data and intrusive business models that require personal data as the revenue generating instrument online. We can get rid of things like advertising-based business models. And that, to me, is an extremely exciting prospect. As a parting thought, I wanted to ask how many of you have ever seen this HTTP status code? It's a real one. I didn't make it up. So that was included in the specifications for HTTP from way back when. Payments as an integral part of how the web operates was always the idea, but no one had really ever figured out how to make it work, how to make it so. And my belief is that while at the time this code was reserved for future use, today the code is ready for use. And our opportunity is now to integrate payments into the web and change the whole business model and the whole way it operates. Thanks very much.
Agradeço muito. Alô? Agradeço bastante ao Adrian Bailey para sua conferência, pela sua palestra. É um tema complexo, é um tema difícil porque é novo, envolve também grandes interesses e também envolve complexidades técnicas. E estou admirado que ainda não tenha fila nos microfones para fazer perguntas, né? Estou bastante admirado, achei que já ia ter assim, umas filas imensas, né? Mas agora é o momento para que a gente possa dialogar com o Adrian e também trazermos as nossas ideias, as nossas contribuições. Aqui, depois lá. E quem mais quiser fazer pergunta, por favor, não se acanhe, pode levantar aqui e ficar esperando aqui na fila. Obrigado. Não esqueçam, tá, de falar o nome e de onde são.
Hi, Adrian. My name is Wellington, and I am a Java programmer. And I'd like to know if you have some specific technology that you recommend for us to work with web payment. As a Java developer, I know that that it's coming out a new API called Money API on JDK 9. And I would like to know if you know about it and you have something to say about it.
Okay, so I don't know about the Java stuff specifically. In terms of web technology, the intention will be that there will be an API in the browser to initiate payments. So from any website, web application where you want to accept a payment, it doesn't just have to be a store. It can be any payment. You'll be able to call that API and you'll be able to provide that API with a list of ways that you want to be paid. And what will happen is there'll be a discovery process either within the browser or within the digital wallet, which will match up the payment instruments that the user has with the ones that the website accepts, and it will prompt the user to pick which one they want to use, confirmations, maybe biometric security, whatever else that payment instrument supports, and then submit that back to the site. Now this is all quite new, so these are all proposals still. There'll be work within the W3C to finalize them, to produce a recommendation. But in terms of the web, that's where we're aiming for. That's kind of the user-facing piece. The back-end stuff, it's complex, as Wagner says. There are existing standards for payments, but predominantly those standards are used between banks. So unless you're writing software for a bank or software for a payment gateway, you're probably not interested in ISO 20022 or ISO 8583 standards. Those are the predominant standards, but until you're in that industry, generally you don't care about them. And I think where companies like Stripe or Braintree have been very successful is they've taken a lot of the complexity for everyday developers doing online payments, and they've abstracted it away and given you APIs. The challenge there is you're buying into a specific API, and to adjust your payment acceptance, let's say, from one product to the other, means you have to go and redevelop all of that stuff. Did that answer the question?
Thank you.
Bom dia, meu nome é Williamson, sou de Campinas. Incrível, bacana, trouxe a gente para uma visão nova, diferente, inovando aí no pagamento. Existem documentações e projetos em andamento, mais de um, onde a gente pode encontrar, como a gente pode contribuir, e W3C no Brasil tem documentação, está começando, como que está isso? Qual a contribuição atual?
Thank you. So the Web Payments Community Group is a great place to start. It's a mailing list. It's facilitated by the W3C, like all the other community groups. There is a mailing list, a website, a lot of proposed standards already put forward. That group is actually split out and is dealing with credentials as well. So there's two community groups that I think a lot of people here would find really interesting in being involved in. The payment side, as well as exchange of secure credentials, which is not limited to payments. In terms of the interest group, that mailing list is also public. You can join the mailing list, be part of the conversations. You'll know whenever things are being published. You can contribute to them, comment on them. The W3 is an open standards body. That's the beauty of it. So, the benefit for me as part of a member organization is I'm participating directly in face-to-face meetings and so on, but everybody has the opportunity to comment, and we're obligated to take your comments on board. So, if we get together and we propose one way of doing things and the general public who are not part of W3C member organizations disagree, they can say that, and we need to consider those comments. We need to give you feedback. So I would start by going onto the W3C site and looking at the web payments activity page, and that'll give you links to the wikis, the mailing lists, all of those. I absolutely do hope a lot of you get involved. I have a personal bugbear with the lack of South African involvement in this whole process, and I'm doing some things on my own side to try and stimulate that. We really need input from countries other than North American countries, European countries. We're getting increasing input from the East, from places like China and Japan, but but at the moment, South America is vastly underrepresented, as is Africa. So please, get involved.
Eu sou a Yasa, eu trabalho para o escritório W3C, e só para complementar a resposta que o chefe pediu, eu estou participando do grupo de Web Payments, e qualquer um que tiver interesse em participar, pode vir falar comigo. A gente está trabalhando com a CIP, que é a Câmara Interbancária de Pagamentos, e a gente tem interesse em angariar cada vez mais desenvolvedores e pessoas interessadas no assunto aqui no Brasil. Você está convidado para assistir a trilha de Web Payments à tarde, que vai ser bem legal também.
Vai. Olá, Adrian. Obrigado pela sua palestra. Meu nome é Ricardo Pop. Eu trabalho no governo federal, com novas mídias. A minha pergunta é a seguinte: pelo que eu vi daquela previsão que você faz de futuro, né, a partir daquele gráfico de abundância da informação, a partir do momento em que o trânsito de informação começou a ser facilitado pela internet, pela web, o volume de informação cresceu. E se eu entendi bem do teu argumento, você imagina um futuro assim para o tráfego para o trânsito de valor, né? Você chama de valor. Aí eu te pergunto o seguinte: informação é um recurso abundante. O valor não necessariamente é um recurso abundante. Mesmo as moedas digitais baseadas em blockchain, como o Bitcoin, cada vez mais você vai tendo menos possibilidade de minerar, né? A quantidade de moeda que você minera a cada conjunto de anos vai diminuindo. Então, como que a gente resolve essa equação? Não pode levar a um futuro distópico, um futuro ruim, de que essa mensagem começa a aparecer para muitas pessoas que não vão ter dinheiro para ir além, trafegar na internet. Então, esse é um ponto. E aí uma pergunta que tem a ver com essa conectada: como que os países em que isso já está avançando, como a África do Sul, estão lidando com regulação? Se isso já é uma discussão e como essa discussão está acontecendo.
Okay, so the first question relates to that graph and the exponential growth in exchange of information that followed the advent of the web, and my prediction that a freer movement of value will result in a similar effect. So let me say, I don't think we will create value from thin air. It's not necessarily I'm not necessarily suggesting that suddenly we'll be able to create more money. It's just that money will move more freely. There will be much more movement of money, and that in itself is extremely valuable to the global economy. So there's an economic term called the velocity of money. How often does the same money get spent, or how quickly does it get spent? So I send you some money. If from the time I send it, it takes 2 hours before you're able to spend it because it's stuck in the system, that money is useless to the economy. It's useless to anyone. It can't be spent anywhere. Whereas if we can collapse down those timelines, if the moment I send you money, you can send it on, that money is useful immediately. And there are measurements in terms of how an increase in the velocity of money will stimulate the global economy, and it's in the millions and billions of dollars. It's huge. Just that effect of money not being stuck in the system is really valuable. That's the only value we will really create from nothing, if you like. We're unlocking capital that's sitting dormant and doing nothing. The second question was relating to how can we advance these ideas, and how do we deal with regulation and so on. So I do think there will need to be some adjustments to regulation. The current regulation we have today is based upon the infrastructure we have today, where banks speak to banks and the communication lines are quite closed. But I think it doesn't take a lot for that regulation to become flexible enough to say, if you are licensed to be a settlement system, then you can be one, and your credentials can be digital. You don't need to have an established physical connection to somebody for them to use you. You can just be on the web, and you can prove that you're a licensed settlement institution, and the flow of payments through you will be tagged with your credentials to say this flowed through the settlement system in Brazil. And when I'm trying to make a payment and I look for a path for that payment, if in that request I say my payment legally, my regulations prohibit it from going through a specific country, then whatever tool I'm using to find me payment paths must exclude those. That level of detail, we still need to figure out how that's going to work. But my suggestion is we have the technology today to solve it. We just haven't put it all together yet. So I think things like Bitcoin, things like Ripple, any distributed ledger technologies with public key infrastructure have really given us a jump start, woken us up to the possibilities for public key infrastructure, where I think for a lot of people it's underutilized. We think of it as SSL, whereas actually there's a huge amount we can do in this space, payments and credentialing with public key infrastructure.
Francisco Júnior. Bom dia, sou Francisco Júnior. Tem uma pergunta sobre o Bitcoins. Aqui em São Paulo já tem comerciantes dando opção para clientes fazer pagamento com Bitcoins, utilizando um app no celular. Então a transação fica via QR Code. Eu queria ver uma opinião sua, o que você acha sobre essa utilização que agora os comerciantes estão utilizando, fazer pagamento, dar uma opção com Bitcoins. Se isso é seguro ou não.
So I think cryptocurrencies are young. It's early days. I think they bring a huge amount of value to the ecosystem. Everything they offer is solving a particular problem, or they wouldn't have become so popular. So are Bitcoins safe? It depends who's holding your Bitcoin wallet, who you buy your Bitcoins from. Do you trust the cryptography that underlies Bitcoin? Do you trust the whole Bitcoin system? Every time you decide to use a particular payment system, there's an element of trust. So the established payment systems have big banks or big brands or international companies behind them, and we trust those brands. We choose to. So you walk into a shop and you hand over a card that says Visa or MasterCard, and the shop owner has a terminal that has that same brand on it. There's trust in that brand that when I give this guy my card, he's not going to take all my money out of my bank. He's only going to charge me for what I've asked for because he's subject to rules of that payment scheme. He's subject to regulations under that payment scheme. So I think what we want to get to is a point where the ecosystem is open so that users have more choice. The ability to choose how you want to pay becomes your choice. And it doesn't matter how the shop accepts payment. I choose to keep all my money in XRP. That's if I want to make that choice and I want to that's the only money I'm ever going to hold, I should be able to do that because when I want to make a payment to somebody out there will buy my XRP and they will sell it for dollars, and the hops along the line will happen so that the receiver gets the money they want in the currency or the denomination or whatever they want in the way that they want. That's the long-term vision. That's where we ultimately want to be. So I see Bitcoin, I see all of these cryptocurrencies as a valuable part of that ecosystem. What I don't see is them becoming the center of the ecosystem. That's not a web architecture. That's a centralized architecture.
Ok, tenho uma última pergunta. Todas essas proposições que levam a uma internet de valor, na verdade, todas as proposições que são inovadoras, elas encontram quase sempre, pelo menos no seu início, uma grande gama de resistência por parte principalmente daquele ecossistema que já está estabelecido há muito tempo. No caso, né, do que é relativo à internet, né, de valor ou dos meios de pagamento, é um fato que isso ainda precisa encontrar mais eco no sistema bancário, sistema financeiro, e principalmente por parte dos bancos centrais, né? A última pergunta foi relativa ao Bitcoin, que né, uma movimentação, permite uma movimentação financeira, né, que está fora do sistema internacional financeiro. A minha pergunta é: como é que você lida com esses processos, né, de inovação, né, que precisam enfrentar, derrubar as resistências? Como é que você lida com o ecossistema estabelecido, né? E particularmente, como é que você vê a possibilidade de coexistência do regulamentado e do não regulamentado?
So, and this is one of the fantastic things I found at Ripple Labs, is the attitude in the company is very constructive. So Ripple Labs are interested in being inclusive, in I think it's me, in being open, but mostly being constructive. And that's, I think, that's a marketing problem that cryptocurrencies have had for a while, is that they're viewed by the existing institutions, the incumbents, as something that is purely disruptive. It's just there to break what exists and replace it. And I don't think that's the case. I think what we want is an ecosystem where all of those things work together. So as a standard setting body, or in our ability to standardize how these things communicate, we can only go so far. We can say, this is the way it can work. But there needs to be incentive for the incumbents to participate. So there needs to be incentive for them to say, wow, this makes sense. We'll implement those standards. We'll open our accounts up to be part of this Internet of Value. And that can happen in two ways. In Europe, it's being mandated. So, you know, there is a movement, or there was a directive, I'm not sure what you call it, called SEPA 2 in the EU, where over the next few years, banks are going to be obligated to expose access to their accounts through APIs. And registered payment service providers must be allowed to access those APIs. So that's the beginnings of what we're talking about, where everything is accessible through standardized APIs, and anybody can be that intermediary in the middle, offering to be the settlement service provider between two accounts. The other way it can happen is the innovator's dilemma. You know, the classic conundrum you face as an incumbent in an established industry, where the innovators, if you don't support them, you ultimately get, you compete with them. And I think I'm very positive about this, because in our experience within Ripple Labs, the financial institutions are really interested in working with us, in working with organizations like the W3C to solve these problems, to be part of the solution. I haven't encountered a huge amount of resistance, maybe naivety, maybe ignorance, but not really resistance to the ideas that we're talking about here. They're resistant to someone coming along and saying, you're out, Bitcoin's in. But that's a different message, right? If you're saying, we want to open the ecosystem, we want to give your customers a better service, we want to remove this correspondent banking model that costs everybody a lot of money. Sure, there are going to be people whose profit margins are affected by that, but we have to persuade them that in the new world where money moves more freely, there's an opportunity for them to make lower margins per transaction, but process more transactions. There's got to be a value in them participating. And I think on the commercial side for the banks, that value is there. I think we've seen a lot of people interested in being market makers, in being account holders, in being part of this ecosystem. On the regulatory side, we have quite a strong regulatory division within Ripple Labs, and we're dealing with regulators around the world all the time, and they firstly want to understand things like virtual currencies and what do we do with it? Is it a commodity? Is it a currency? How does it work? But more importantly, they want to understand how to adapt to just ensure that they're still doing what they're supposed to do. Protect their consumers, protect people against losing all of their money through ignorance, protect themselves against terrorism, those kind of things. And it depends who you speak to. Where you draw that line is always going to be different. But I don't think any regulator or any commercial entity that we've come across are flatly against these ideas. They need to know more, they want to learn more. And that's also our challenge for everyone here, is if you believe in this whole model, if you believe in what we're putting forward here, is to put the public pressure on people to take it on, to learn about it, to understand it, and realize the value.
Como últimas palavras, você é dos líderes, você é o co-chair do grupo de interesse de pagamentos na web, do W3C, e que pretende fazer e desenvolver muitos trabalhos pela frente. Quem você gostaria de ter nesse grupo? Que tipo de pessoas que você convidaria a fazer parte desse grupo de pessoas que vai pensar e desenvolver o futuro do pagamentos na web?
So there are two sides to it. There's the user side, the user-centric side, the work within the browser, that stuff that I talked about in terms of payments initiation. There we need an audience like this. We need people coming from different countries, different perspectives, talking about the use cases that are maybe specific to their jurisdiction, making sure that whatever recommendations are produced by the W3C accommodate those. It doesn't help after the fact to come along and say, wait a minute, the flow that you've standardized here, the browser API, doesn't work for us because in our country we have this regulation that says something different to what you had considered. On the settlement side, really, again, it's open, but at the end of the day, holding money is something that every government regulates to some extent. You know, if you're holding deposits for people, governments regulate that, and so any entities involved there in the regulation, in the actual holding of the money, in the processing of payments, we want involved in this in this process, as well as anybody who has experience or ideas in this field. So the current interest group has a great diversity of interested parties covering both of those fields, both the consumer retail payment side as well as the settlement side. And I think part of the reason we're making such good progress is because of that. But there's always room for stakeholders bringing perspectives from different parts of the world, perspectives on different regulation, perspectives on different payment instruments that maybe we didn't know about. As a good example, Leandro from the Brazilian clearinghouse was at the face-to-face meeting we had in New York, and he gave a presentation to us on Boleto, which was a use case that nobody else within the group understood until he had presented it. So that use case is now part of the Web Payments Working Group requirements, and when we put together the browser API, it needs to accommodate the flows that are common in a Boleto. That's a great example of where participation is essential.
Ok, muito obrigado, Adrian Hope-Bailey. Bela apresentação, boa participação. A todos vocês que participaram ativamente, muito obrigado. Vamos fazer aquele intervalo desejado para o almoço. Temos algumas opções em volta. O almoço é por cada um de vocês. Se vocês atravessarem a Avenida Rebouças, vocês vão encontrar ainda mais opções. 2 horas, nós estamos de volta. Muito obrigado a todos vocês.